Okay, so when I say the name Sappho, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Be honest. Is it, oh yeah, the ancient Greek lesbian poet? Because same. That's usually the headline, right? That's the trivia fact, the elevator pitch, the Wikipedia blurb energy. Most people, when you ask them about Sappho, if they know about her at all, know that she was a Greek poet who liked women, and they might know that she was from the island of Lesbos, which consequently is where we get the term lesbian. But today, we're not doing the elevator pitch. We are not flattening her into a fun fact, and we are most definitely not reducing one of the most influential poets in Western history to, and she liked women. Because Sappho quite literally was everything it means to be a woman, and she was treated as such, even way back then. She was messy. She was political, exiled, idolized, misquoted, worshipped, burned, fragmented, erotic, and tender. And to be completely honest, she is a fucking badass. So today, we're going back and talking about the OG Sapphic creative. Back to 600 BCE, and I promise this is not going to be a boring history lesson, okay? To meet the woman who quite literally gave us the word lesbian and then got almost completely erased. On this week's episode of Sapphic Side Quest, cue the jam sesh. So Sappho lived around 630 to 570 BCE on the island of Lesbos. Yeah, that Lesbos, which is how we get the word lesbian. Not because she invented being gay, obviously, but because she was from Lesbos and she wrote love poems to women that were so profound that the island's name literally became shorthand and synonymous for queer desire. Like, how incredible is that you write poetry and they're like, yeah, this island's known for one thing and one thing only, and it's gay panic and queer love. Like, I think that that's so badass. So her name in Greek is Sappho. Most people think it's Sapphos, but it's just Sappho. And she was famous in her lifetime. Like, I need to repeat that because I need you to understand how massive that is. So everybody knows Van Gogh, right? One of the most influential artists in history. But Van Gogh, for instance, was laughed out of town. His paintings were considered trash. He was penniless for the majority of his life. He didn't actually gain notoriety and fame until he died. Which, trigger warning, he killed himself. He shot him. He went out into a field and shot himself in the gut or in the stomach. And it wasn't until he passed that he posthumously became now known as one of the most renowned and most influential artists in human history. He never got to live, he never lived to see that. And I always find that so tragic because Starry Night is my absolute favorite painting of all time. I just love it so much. But my point being is that he never got to live to see it. And a lot of people, I don't say celebrities, but a lot of artists back throughout history have been that way. They were not considered great until they died. But not Sappho. She was famous in her lifetime. Like, she lived through this. And she wasn't some obscure poet rediscovered by academics. Like, she was to the point that Plato, like the philosopher Plato, called her and I quote this, the 10th muse. Like, imagine being so talented that philosophers are like, actually, we need to make another goddess for her. Like, that's how incredible she was. And a lot of people don't know this, but she actually performed her poetry to music. She played the lyre, which, if you're not familiar with it, it looks kind of like a harp. Sort of, kind of. It looks like a U, and you play it like in the crook of your arm. And it's got strings running down the middle of it, and you pluck it with your fingers. So she played the lyre, and her work wasn't meant to be read out loud. It was meant to be sung. So really, we're reading lyrics rather than poetry, which obviously those are synonymous of one another because the best lyrics read like poems. So think less dusty textbook, more indie girl with a cult following, touring coastal cities with heartbreak anthems. Um, I put her akin to more like Florence Welch, and I'll get into why later. But I feel like if she was touring, she'd be kind of a mix between a Chappell Roan or not a Chappell Roan, but a Brandy Carlisle and a Florence Welch. But we'll get into that in a little bit. So, but here's where it gets interesting. So the running rumor with Sappho is that she apparently ran a girls' school. A lot of textbooks will say that she ran a girls' school, but I say that the rumor is that she ran a girls' school because historians debate this. What we do know is that she led what's called a theasis. It's a kind of religious and cultural circle for young women, and it likely centered around like devotion to Aphrodite, as well as poetry, music, beauty, and education before marriage. And one thing I do want to make mention of too, when it comes to Greek culture, specifically with women, if you were a devotee to a goddess, most women would refer to themselves as a daughter of that goddess. So whether you're talking about Aphrodite, Artemis, Nyx, Persephone, in Roman culture, Diana, any of those goddesses, whether they're Greek or Roman, a lot of them would refer to themselves as daughters of that deity. And I'll get into why that's important in just a second. But so what this means is that she was mentoring young women in art, spirituality, and expression. Now, here's the thing. Many of her poems are addressed to women in her circle. So it's not like she's just writing about women out in the ether somewhere while she's mentoring these young women. A lot of these young women were the muses of the very poetry that she wrote. Anactoria, Athis, Gongalia, they're not subtle either. She writes about longing, jealousy, physical desire, watching another woman laugh and feeling her heart race and her tongue break, which is in fragment 31. And that's one of her most famous surviving fragments. So if we want to talk about sapphic yearning and seeing the woman you love fall in love with someone else, this would be that poem. This would be any love song you have ever heard that's like, I'm watching you fall in love with somebody else and I wish it was me. This would be the OG version of that. So fragment 31, it survives because later writers would quote it. So it goes something like, he seems to me equal to the gods, the man who sits facing you and hears you close, speaking sweetly and laughing delightfully. Now she's talking about the man that this woman is talking to. And then she describes what happens to her body while watching the woman she loves talk to this man. Her heart pounds, her tongue breaks, a thin flame runs under her skin. She can't see, her ears ring, she trembles, she grows pale as grass. This was 2,600 years ago, mind you. And she's not talking about when she says her heart pounds, her tongue breaks. She's not talking about the woman that is her object of affection. She's talking about herself. She's quite literally describing the feeling of a yearning that you can't in that moment express and you can't vocalize it. You have to hold all of that energy in. And she's literally describing a gay panic spiral. And this is the closest thing I can think of to it. We don't know if the woman that she's talking about knew Sappho's feelings for her or not. But let me read that again. So we've all been there where we have feelings for a woman and they like somebody else. And they're just not with you or whatever the case may be. Maybe you're in the friend zone and that's fine, or you've never told them. But put yourself back in that position, in that moment And Sappho is writing, her heart pounds, her tongue breaks, a thin flame runs under her skin, so she gets flushed, she gets hot. She can't see, her ears ring, she trembles, and she grows pale as grass. What makes this wild is that it's not just that it's queer, it's that it's embodied. Like before Sappho, epic poetry was about war, gods, heroes, think the Iliad, the Odyssey, Sparta, all that stuff, right? She, on the other hand, makes poetry about the body, about internal sensations, about desire from a woman's perspective. She is quite literally the OG sapphic audio erotica content creator. And that was revolutionary. And of course, it didn't come without its own consequences. So, of course, there was drama involved with Sappho, and we don't really know the specifics of it. But at some point in her life, Sappho and her family were actually exiled to Sicily for quote unquote political reasons. And I put that in quotes because, like I said, we don't know all the details. But it likely had to do with like aristocratic power struggles in Lesbos, and more than likely she made somebody uncomfortable because of her poetry. Who knows? But she was exiled, her and her family. Like they all went. They're like, get the fuck out of here. We don't want you here. Go over there. So they exiled her from Lesbos to Sicily, which Sicily, as you know, is in Italy. So we're talking not even on the same island. Like they're really like, get the fuck out of here. We don't want you here at all. So she wasn't just like floating around writing love poetry, playing her lyre, just la 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 la, I'm fine. She literally lived through political upheaval, and she was displaced because of it. Now, she later went back to Lesbos, but exile shapes people. And obviously when she went back, there was stigma attached to her name. She was ostracized a lot. We can deduce that probably a lot of people didn't want anything to do with her. And so when you read her poems, particularly the fragments that we have that are about the longing and the yearning, knowing that she had been torn from her home, her community, the only life she'd ever known, maybe even the women that she loved, it hits completely different. It hits in a way that's a calling back to home and a calling back to something that you need, right? And so that makes it so much more heartbreaking. And this is kind of the part of Sappho's story that makes me really like upset and feral, and makes it more tragic as well, is that Sappho in her lifetime that we know of wrote 9 full volumes of poetry. 9. Okay? You want to take a guess how many poems of hers we actually have? 1. And it's not even complete. We have 1 out of 9 fucking volumes. This incredible woman, we only have 1 partially complete. It is almost nearly complete, but not entirely complete poem. Everything else is in fragments. If you remember before, I mentioned fragment 31, which was the poem that I just read a second ago. All of her poems, aside from the one that we have that's nearly completed, is considered a fragment, and they're numbered as such. Fragment 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth, because they're literally just torn pieces of papyrus. And fragment 31 we only have because it was quoted by someone else. Typically, it's quoted by another man, right? Or at least when they started resurfacing, they were quoted by other men. Obviously, now we have women that will quote Sappho's work, but they're lines quoted by other men. They're words that only survive because someone else referenced them. And why is that? Well, some of it is normal historical loss. Papyrus disintegrates, libraries burn, but a lot of it was intentional. And make no mistake, Sappho is not the only woman in history that has been so influential that her work has been purposefully destroyed. Like nearly 1,000 years later, in Alexandria, there was a philosopher and astronomer and mathematician known as Hypatia. Her work got burned as well, and she was actually publicly executed. And I'm not going to get into the gory details of her death. You can absolutely look those up. But it just goes to show that women that are influential, men will make every attempt possible and have made every attempt possible in history to not only discredit us, but to erase us from existence. And in the case of Sappho, Christian scholars specifically deemed her work immoral, too erotic, too feminine, too pagan. So her poetry wasn't carefully preserved the way that male poets were. And so because of that, we lost Sapphic desire because someone, a man, decided that it was dangerous, of course. Like, can you imagine what it would look like if we had her full body of work? Like, I don't know about you, but I love writing poetry. I love giving poetry, especially to the women in my life that I love. I'm a huge sucker for giving poetry, especially to significant others, or to the person that I'm dating, and writing poetry for the person that I'm dating. And Sappho is a huge inspiration for a lot of that, as I'm sure it is for a lot of other queer folks. Could you imagine what that conversation or what that poetry would look like if we had all 9 volumes instead of just the fragments that we have and the nearly complete singular poem? Can you imagine what conversations we were robbed of, what queer lineage was interrupted? Because, again, Sappho isn't just history. She is literally part of our lineage. She's part of of what makes us us as Sapphics, as lesbians. It's what is really ingrained in us. It's been this way since the dawn of time. And so there's also this persistent myth, to add insult to injury, and to go even further into the erasure of Sappho. There's also this persistent myth that Sappho killed herself over a man named Phaon. Now, you can actually go on to Google and type in the death of Sappho. And what I find really gross and disgusting about this is you can actually buy phone cases and prints of this. It's like a painting or a body of work that kind of illustrates the, quote, death of Sappho. And the story goes is that she threw herself off of a cliff like most tragic heroines back then. So the story appears a century later in Roman poetry. And so suspiciously, it very much reads like, what if we make her tragic and heterosexual? Because nothing says tragedy like a woman who's just pining over a man so bad that she throws herself off of a cliff. Because historically, when powerful queer women exist, later cultures get uncomfy. They rewrite us, they soften us, they give them a man, they give us a man, because Lord knows we can't exist without one, according to them. But when you read her surviving poems, the emotional intensity towards women is not only undeniable, but in my opinion, it's palatable. And honestly, it doesn't need modern labels. But the desire is there. It's tender. It's devotional. It's erotic. It's all the things that I personally love about being a lesbian and being Sapphic. I don't know about any of you, but one of my most favorite things about myself is that I am a lesbian, or that I'm Sapphic. Like it's one of my most favorite things. And that's part of the reason for it, is that it's hard to contextualize the amount of emotion and love and devotion that I, as a woman, feel for another woman. It's hard to contextualize that. It's hard to put that into words. And sometimes if I do, it feels like it's just not enough. Like it's barely scratching the surface sometimes. And so to that point, the one nearly complete poem that we have of Sappho is lovingly called Ode to Aphrodite. Now, in it, she calls on Aphrodite to help her win back a woman that she loves. So In part, she writes, "If she flees, soon she shall pursue. If she refuses gifts, she shall give them. If she does not love, soon she shall love." It's playful, it's intimate, it's confident. She talks to the goddess like she's talking to a friend. And calling back to what I said earlier, where you have to understand from a historical context, Greek women that were parishioners and devotees of a goddess would particularly refer to themselves as daughters of that goddess. So it's very likely that Sappho referred to herself as a daughter of Aphrodite, especially if you were in the position of teaching and mentoring others about said deity, right? So we can even almost go even further with this and say that she's talking to the goddess like a mother, like a child calling to a mother and pleading for her to help her. And again, this is a woman publicly writing love poetry to another woman in 600 BCE. Like, we talk about queer visibility like it's new, and it's not. And back to what I said, Sappho isn't just queer history. She's not just queer trivia. She is lineage. Like, for those of us that identify as lesbian and sapphic, these are our roots. This right here is our roots. This is fabric. It's part of our DNA, the fabric of what makes us us. And I find that so beautiful and so complicated, but also just so vivid and incredible. And not only is queer visibility not new in that regard, it's ancient. It's so old. I mean, we're talking about a woman who wrote about this 2,500 years ago. And so for me, especially doing this podcast, Sappho is proof that queer women have always existed. And she is one of the things that reminds me on a consistent basis of why telling our stories is so important. Because she reminds me how fragile our history is. If we don't preserve queer art, it disappears. Entire volumes are lost. If we don't tell our stories, if we don't use our voices, if we don't speak our existences out into the ether and let people know that we exist, then we will cease to exist in the long run. Because history will not waste any time erasing us from the timeline. Like, imagine if 2,000 years from now, someone only had a singular screenshot of your favorite queer poem, or your favorite piece of queer literature, or your favorite lyric. That's what we have from her, is literally just fragments. And still, despite the fact that that is all that we have, that out of 9 volumes of poetry, we have one nearly incomplete poem and a bunch of frickin' fragments, say that 3 times fast, those fragments changed literature forever, like on a massive scale. So if we were to reframe Sappho through a modern lens, she wasn't just a lesbian poet, which, to give you context in terms of how influential Sappho would be today, the closest I can think of is the late Andrea Gibson, which, if you've never listened to Andrea Gibson, I believe they went by Andy, and they identified as non-binary. So if you've never listened to any of Andy's poetry, I highly recommend that you do. You can go on YouTube and it's under their full name, so Andrea Gibson. They also wrote books that you can purchase. And when I first discovered them, their poetry touched me in such a way that I still can't describe. I still will read their poetry and it will bring me to tears because it's just so profound. And I have a feeling that if we had Sappho's full body of work, it would be close to the same. So through a modern lens, if we were not going to categorize Sappho as strictly a lesbian poet, she would also have been or was a lyric innovator, a musical performer, a teacher, a mentor, a political exile, a spiritual devotee, and self proclaimed daughter of Aphrodite, and a cultural icon in her own lifetime, which again is huge. The fact that she was that big of an icon prior to her death. Her influence actually shaped Roman poets like Catullus and Ovid, and she created a poetic voice that was centered on interiority and longing, so internal feelings, that sapphic yearning, that gay panic we talked about earlier. So she made desire sacred and was really the first to put it down on paper. And honestly, that's the sapphic blueprint. Like if I was to contextualize her and akin her to what I think she would be like today, I think that she'd be close to a Florence Welch and a Brandi Carlile. And so like I just want to read one more tiny fragment of her poetry. And it's just a line. And it goes, "Someone, I tell you, in another time will remember us." Like, tell me that that doesn't wreck you. Like, she knew. She knew that her love, her circle, her women, even if forgotten at some point, would echo forward. Even if all of that was gone, she would still somehow move forward and it would echo forward. And here we are, 2,500 years later, remembering her, speaking her name. Maybe this entire episode you've been like, yeah, Elise, I know this. I'm aware of who Sappho is, but I wanted to put it in perspective of how important she is and how wonderful it is that we do have what we do have of her, as tragic as it is that we've lost 9 volumes. We didn't lose everything. And so, like I said, if Sappho were alive today, I think she'd be writing devastating indie songs. I'm not going to put her in the category of pop, because if I was to think of her, I would think of her closer to, like I said, a Brandi Carlile or a Florence Welch, because if you've ever been to either concert by either one of those individuals, it's very, you feel it, like in your body, you feel it. And you stay present in those moments. And I feel like Sappho would be the same. She'd probably have a Patreon somewhere. And I don't think she'd be one of those, artists that are these big monolithic behemoth things that, or behemithic things that are untouchable. I think she would want to be down in the trenches with her fans and with the women that adore her. And that's why I kin her to Florence Welch like I do, because if you've ever been to a Florence Welch concert, one of the things that Florence is well known for is getting off of the stage and walking up to her fans and physically touching them, like hugging them or putting her hand on their faces. And it's just this level of intimacy and connection that is lacking a lot. And I understand that that's not doable for every artist. I'm very much aware of that. But I think one of the reasons that Florence can do that is because the majority of her fans are women. And I think that that's a huge difference, right? And then Brandi Carlile with her acoustic lyrics, it brings that poetry into another level. And I think even still, if she was alive today, I think she'd still be dangerous, because women doing anything is dangerous. Women writing about women, women, making advancements in their field, or so many times they do profound work and it's either erased or the credit is taken from by a man, and they're forgotten about. I'm looking at you, F. Scott Fitzgerald, because we all know that your wife wrote The Great Gatsby. Just saying. And there's been so many times throughout history that women, particularly writers, have had to write under male pen names because otherwise they wouldn't get published. And so really with women, anything that we do is dangerous. But when you add a queer, level to it, when you add that layer, it makes it even more dangerous. And I don't think that there will be a point in my lifetime, I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think that there will ever be a point in my lifetime where being a queer woman, or just being queer in general, or even just being a woman, isn't dangerous, right? I don't think in my lifetime I will ever see it. I hope I'm wrong. So the only advice at that point is that if your existence as a queer woman or as a sapphic is inherently dangerous, if you just simply existing is dangerous, then exist loudly, love proudly, go balls to the wall with it, do what you want to do, live the life you want to live, because you're never safe anyway, right? In that regard. So in this instance, and to tie back to this, the sapphic reality in the side quest in this story of Sappho is simply this. If I could take anything away from the story of Sappho's, the life of Sappho, to give to you of, hey, this is your mission, your side quest, if you will, is to preserve each other, love each other, archive our art, and to write boldly enough and exist boldly enough that even if they try to burn it, even if they try to erase it and rewrite our stories, a fragment of it survives and says, I was here. I existed. And this is my story. If you like this episode, share it with someone who loves queer history and all things sapphic. And next time someone says to you, Sappho, you mean the lesbian poet? You can quite literally say, oh, babe, it's so much bigger than that. Until next time, this is Elise on Sapphic Side Quest. See you next week. Bye.